On these Sunday mornings, we're looking at generally at the book of Revelation, and more particularly and more specifically, we're looking at the letters to the seven churches at this point. Those seven letters to the seven churches comprise two chapters in the book of Revelation. They comprise chapters 2 and chapter 3. So, as we have looked at the past number of churches, we now come to the letter to the church in the city of Sardis, and that begins chapter 3. Christ is speaking to John, and he has this message for the messenger, or the some translations render it the angel, but really it's the messenger or the pastor of the church in the city of Sardis. And the words read in this fashion: "To the messenger of the church in the city of Sardis write these words. These are the words of him who holds the seven spirits." So that idea, that metaphor, that image is one of security. The churches, the congregations have security because they are firmly held in the grip of Christ himself. And that means that regardless of what transpires, regardless of what happens, the church's future is secure because it is rooted in the firm grip, the hold, the grasp of Christ himself. Then the words continue. He holds the seven spirits of God, and he holds the seven stars. He says this word about the congregation in the city of Sardis. Listen closely. He says, "I know your deeds. I know your deeds." And then he says, an interesting word, he says, "I know your many deeds, your multitudinous deeds, your multiple deeds. You're an active place, you're a busy place." He says, "I know your many deeds, your many activities, and I know that you have a reputation of being alive. But in reality," he says, "you are dead." It's an interesting statement, a rather blunt, a rather brutal statement, and direct statement. He says, from the outside looking in, you have a reputation of a congregation that is alive, but in reality, you are dead. He says in verse 2, therefore, this is his prescription for their condition. He says, therefore, wake up, strengthen what remains and what is about to die. For I have found your deeds unfinished. I'm not through with you, he's saying. He's saying, I have found your deeds unfinished. I'm not through with you. Your mission is not over. Your task, your objectives are not completed. He says, wake up, strengthen what remains and what is about to die. For I have found your deeds unfinished in the sight of my God. And then he says, remember, therefore, what you have received and what you have heard. Hold it fast and change your ways. But if you do not wake up, he says, I will indeed of necessity come as a thief, and you will not know when I come to you. So he says, either you fix things or I will fix things. Verse 4, he says, yet I want you to remember this about your congregation there in the city of Sardis. He says, you have a few people in the city of Sardis who have not soiled their clothes. It's an interesting metaphor, an interesting image. He says, you have a few people who have remained faithful. You have a few people who've remained loyal. You have a few people that are genuinely and authentically thriving. He says, they will walk with me. They will continue to walk with me. You don't have to worry about them faltering. You don't have to worry about them falling away. He says, they will continue to walk with me. They will be dressed in white, for they are indeed worthy because of their faithfulness. The one who is victorious will, like them, be dressed in white. I will never blot out the name of that person from the book of life, but will acknowledge that name before my Father and his angels. And then we have the typical ending for the letters to the seven churches. Christ gives this word. He says, whosoever has ears, let him hear what the Spirit of God says to his churches. If I were to take that text this morning and sum it up in one word, it would be reputation. Reputation. I like that opening sentence. He says, you have a reputation of being alive. A reputation is so important in life. When we think about our lives, we want, among other things about our lives, to have a good reputation. Reputation is important to us personally. We want a good reputation in the community. We want our family name to be spoken well of. When we have our children go out into the world, we want them to honor the reputation of the family name, the reputations of the family traditions, and to honor all the traditions and values that the family has stood for. Reputation is important to us, isn't it? Reputation is important to us as individuals. Reputation is important to us as families. Reputation is important to us on virtually every level of life. Reputation is important to us in our businesses. We want our businesses to have a good reputation of caring for people and of serving people and of selling people quality goods and those kinds of things. Reputation is so important in life on every level. But not only is reputation important in those areas, but this word tells us that reputation is important in the life of congregations. Now think about that. That's true. We all know that to be true. Reputation is so important in the life of every congregation. So this was a congregation that truly did have a reputation. It's summed up in that statement. He says, you have a reputation of being alive. He says this in the city of Sardis. He says, when the people think about you there in Sardis, when they look at you, they say that that is a congregation that has a good reputation. They are busy. They are on mission. They are active. They are filled with a multiplicity of programs and all of those things. They're busy. They do everything that the Southern Baptist Convention of Texas tells them to do. They do everything that the Baptist General Convention of Texas tells them to do. They have this program and they have that program. There's always cars pulling into the lot and cars pulling out of the lot. There are people pouring out of the cars as they pull into the lot to go to the various Sunday school programs and the women's programs and the men's programs. They have a nice building and they have a nice facility, all of these things. He says, you have a reputation when people pass by you of being a congregation that is very much alive. That's your reputation. But then he says, I see things quite differently. I look beyond all of those things. I look to the heart of the matter, he says. You have a reputation outside of your walls as a congregation, he says, of being alive. But in reality, he says, you are dead. It's an interesting statement. You are living with a reputation of being alive and thriving because people see your many activities. But in reality, you are dead. Now, this is a word that's a challenging word for this reason, because we want to see it as a positive word. This is not a word that's speaking to those congregations, in many instances like our little congregation, that is limited on programs and is limited on agendas and limited on resources and limited on worship services. This is not a congregation for congregations like our little congregations and many other congregations in our area that are not able to have a great degree of programs. This is not a word for those kinds of congregations, for our kind of congregations. It would be erroneous for us to apply this word to us and think that because we are limited, because we are small, because we are because we have a limited amount of programs, that he's speaking about us. No, that's not what this word is speaking to. This word is speaking to those congregations who, from the outside, they look like they are thriving businesses. Their parking lots are full. Their programs are full. Their pews are full. Their worship services are exciting. Their worship services are thriving. They have cars constantly pulling into the lot. It's a place that's open 7 days a week. It's always open. The lights are always on. The air conditioning is always on. The heating is always on. These congregations are busy places. And he says from the outside, when people look at you with your nice building and your fine building and your expansion of programs and your multiplicity of programs and all of those things, you have programs for preschoolers, you have programs for children, you have programs for singles, you have programs for husbands, you have programs for wives, you have programs for, well, you have more programs than anyone could ever take advantage of. He says from the outside, those congregations look to be very much alive, but don't let appearances deceive you. Just because you have all of those things, you may still be dead. This was a congregation in Sardis that was not a small congregation. It was a thriving congregation. It was busy. It was active. It was on mission. But he says, in the midst of all of your activity, you've missed the point. You've turned it into a business. He says, you have a reputation for being alive, but in reality, you are dead. My biggest fear in reading this week was that we little congregations will take a word like this and apply it to us. It's not meant for us with our limited agendas. It's a word that is meant for those congregations that have a reputation of being alive, looking like shopping malls, thriving with people. But he says, you've missed the mark. Reputation is so important. How do we preserve our reputation? Well, one thing this tells us is this, that we preserve our reputation through reflection. Reflection is important. It's important for all congregations to look upon ourselves and think about what we're doing and why we're doing it. It makes no difference if you're large or if you're small. The first point that we take away from this is we are to be engaged as a congregation in constant reflection as to whether or not we are really truly on task or if we're just going through the motions. We preserve our reputation through reflection. He says, you have a name that you are alive and yet you are dead. And essentially he's saying this, it's like a physical body. He says when a physical body, or we know when a physical body, when life ends for a physical body, what happens is you still have the physical body, but you have no spirit animating it or no spirit moving it or no spirit driving it. That's what Christ's point here is. He says you in the church of Sardis, you may have lots of activities, you may have lots of movement, but the fact of the matter is the spirit has departed. You have missed the mark completely. One individual I was reading this week said this regarding the church of this in the city of Sardis and regarding contemporary congregations. He says, speaking of the spirit moving out of the body and death occurring, he says, what good is a body without a spirit? What good is a body without a spirit? Otherwise, you simply have nothing more than a corpse. I want to remind you folks at First Wallis Baptist Church that we have a good spirit. We have a good spirit at First Wallis Baptist Church. We may not have all of the activities that we think we ought to have, or all of the opportunities that we think we ought to have, or all the programs that we think we ought to have. But one thing you can say about First Wallis Baptist Church is there is a profoundly good spirit at First Wallis Baptist Church. There is unity, there is harmony, there is common vision, there is common purpose, there is cooperation, there is faithfulness, there is dedication, all of those things. One thing we can say is even though the activities that we would prefer may not be present, we still maintain a good spirit. And I would call upon you to reflect upon the spirit of First Wallis Baptist Church. So that's the first way we preserve our reputation. People who come to visit with us know that we have a good spirit, that there is a good fellowship on this corner, in this congregation, in this community, in these days. The second thing we learn from these words regarding reputation is we preserve our reputation through recognition. We recognize that there are those always who were what might be called the faithful remnant. Listen to his words. He says, in the midst of the fact that you are dead in Sardis, in the midst of the fact that you are so active in Sardis, and yet you really are not an alive congregation, he says, you need to remember this. Things are not totally negative there. He says, you have a few names in Sardis who have not defiled their garments. He's speaking of those people in the congregation in Sardis that have remained faithful, that have remained loyal, that have the spirit of the mission in mind, that carry on the mission of the church in a spirit of authenticity. That's what we have here at First Wallis. We might not have the multitudes here at First Wallis, but I'll tell you one thing we do have. We have a faithful remnant that is dedicated to the mission, that is dedicated to the task, that is dedicated to the worship service, that is dedicated to service opportunities that we can afford to engage in. We have a faithful few. He says, look at your reputation and preserve that reputation through reflection upon the positive things about you. And then secondly, he says, look at those faithful few, that faithful remnant that is carrying on the mission in a spirit of authenticity. Now, you've been in church work as long as I have. You've been in church life. You know this, that in any congregation, in any church, you have the faithful few. And while you have those faithful few who keep the lights on, and those faithful few who keep the lawns mowed, and those faithful few who keep the mission going, you have people who come and go. They come and they visit, and they present the vision of making a contribution, and yet they're inconsistent. They're inconsistent in their attendance. They're inconsistent in their participation. They're inconsistent in their loyalty. And as a result of that, you can't build a congregation upon those kinds of individuals. I'm sorry, but you just simply cannot. But he says this, don't look to those people who come and go. Don't look to those people who are Johnny-come-latelys. Those people who show up when it's convenient and conducive to their schedule. That's not where your future lies. He says, look to those people who are the faithful remnant, the faithful few. I'm here to tell you this. You look to those Johnny-come-latelys who come and go in our congregations, our Baptist congregations, and you will be discouraged, and you will be disheartened, and you will be negative. He says, don't look to them. Look to the faithful few, the faithful remnant that are there through thick and that are there through thin, that are faithful even when it is not convenient, that are faithful even when it is not conducive to what they want to do in their lives. He says, remember your reputation and preserve that reputation by looking at those who are faithful, not those who come and who go. Thirdly, he says this about reputation. He says we preserve our reputation through remembrance. He says, remember those in the past that have been faithful. Remember those in the past that have been loyal. He says these words, there are a few immortal names among you, people whose reputations live on. They were dedicated. They committed themselves to your church and your congregation. They carried on the vision. They're no longer with you, but remember those individuals who planted the trees under which you sit today. He says, think about those. Now, in the Old Testament, we have a number of those individuals. I wrote down the Old Testament man by the name of Enoch, who was faithful, and Old Testament man by the name of Elijah, who was faithful, the Old Testament personality by the name of Abram, who was faithful and dedicated and loyal, a man by the name of Lot, who even in the midst of Sodom and Gomorrah was faithful. And this word says this, those are the kinds of people that you think upon. Those are the kind of people that you reflect upon. Remember those people from your past history at First Wallis Baptist Church, and remember those people from your past history in your own Christian journey who were faithful, While other people were coming and going, while other people were hit and missed, while other people were on and off, remember those people who were always there through thick and thin. I have those in my life. I've told you about them repeatedly. I think about a man by the name of Lucian Fry, a dedicated businessman in my home church. Lucian Fry was always dedicated. He was always faithful. He could have been at home each Sunday carrying on business. He could have been at home on Sunday managing the books and doing all the bookkeeping and arranging the goods in his store, the dry goods in his store. He could have found other things to do, but he wasn't committed to doing those things when it was time to give priority to the Lord's things and to the church. This word says, remember people like Lucian Fry, Eddie Carter, not the Johnny-come-latelys or those who come and go or those who are inconsistent. Remember the faithful folks from your past journey, the M.W. Georges, the Cleo Edlins. You have those kinds of people in your life. Don't look to the hit and miss folks. Look to those from the past that have been faithful. Why? Because it fortifies our commitment to our reputation. First thing he says here is we preserve our reputation through reflection. Secondly, he says we preserve our reputation through a recognition. Thirdly, he says we preserve our reputation through remembrance. And then finally, he says we preserve our reputation by remembering our future reward. We preserve our reputation by remembering our future reward. He says, I promise you this. Those people that are faithful, those people that are loyal, I will reward them. He uses metaphoric language to say that. He says they are clothed in white because they've been faithful. He says, I will not blot their name out of the book of life. Why? Because they were authentic from the beginning. He says, I will confess them before my Father. Why? Because they were faithful. He says, remember this. A good reputation, which leads to faithfulness, will inevitably lead to reward. What is our reputation here at First Wallis? Thought a lot about that this past week, or maybe really the past weeks. When people drive past, they might say, well, it's a small congregation. They don't have a youth program for our youth, or they don't have an extensive children's program for our children, or they don't have this, or they don't have that. Their external assessments of us might be one thing. But Christ says, I look deeper. I look deeper. I look past the externalities. I look past the monthly calendar. I look past all the busyness. I look to the heart of the matter. At First Wallis Baptist Church, we're going to continue to do what we do well. We are going to continue to be faithful, to be available. And we may not do everything, but we're going to do the important thing. And that's maintain a reputation of faithfulness that is authentic. Would you bow with me in prayer? Heavenly Father, I thank you for this word to the church in the city of Sardis. I pray that you would bless this word, help us to apply it to our lives at First Wallis in a positive way. Keep us from beating up on ourselves, from seeing ourselves in terms of what we cannot do. Help us to see ourselves in terms of what we are doing we're being faithful. I thank you for those in our little congregation that are there through thick and through thin, that are not hit and miss, that provide the kind of integrity, reliability, and character upon which the kingdom can be built. For it is in the name of Christ we pray these things. Amen. God bless the people of First Wallis Baptist Church.